From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Peggy Pearlstein, head of the Hebraic section here in the African Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. Welcome to today's program, an illustrated lecture by artist calligrapher Debra Band on her new book, Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth and Hannah. This event is being co-sponsored with the District of Columbia Jewish Community Center. And I would like to ask Ms. Lily Gersh, head of the Literary Scholarly Programs, to make some remarks on behalf of the DC JCC.
Thanks, Peggy. My name is Lily Kalish Gersh, and I'm the Director of Literary Music and Dance Programming at the Washington, D.C. JCC. We're honored to be partnering with the Library of Congress for this event, and thank you to Peggy for inviting us to participate. The extremely talented Debra Band is a member of our community, and we were proud to include her this year in our local author fair at our Jewish Literary Festival. So I've gotten a sneak peek at this work, and I can tell you that you're really in for a treat. The DC JCC presents Jewish authors and authors writing on topics of Jewish interest throughout the year as part of our Authors Out Loud literary series. So you can come here for the lunchtime events and then come to us for something after dinner. We have so many wonderful programs coming up, 4 in the next month and many more in the new year. So I invite you to visit our website at washingtondcjcc.org/authorsoutloud and take a look at what we have. And now, back to you, Peggy.
Many of you may be familiar with Deborah already. She spoke here at the library when she published The Song of Songs, The Honeybee in the Garden, and again when I Will Wake the Dawn, Illuminated Psalms appeared in book form. The original paintings from both of these books have toured the United States and Canada. Following the lecture and a book sale and signing today, we'll have the opportunity to view the original artwork for this exhibit in our conference room directly behind me, and there are more than 60 original pieces of work that Deborah's brought with her. I hope that you'll also take the opportunity to view our exhibit, Words Like Sapphires, 100 Years of Hebraica, 1912 to 2012, which is across the Great Hall, directly behind you. Here you will see manuscripts, early printed books, and contemporary illuminated works, primarily by Israeli artists. It's an exhibit that shows the richness of the library's Hebraic treasures. Deborah is our own local treasure. She holds a BA with honors from Concordia University in Montreal and a Master of Science degree in Political Science from MIT. She's descended from a long line of rabbis. She married into a family of scholars of modern Hebrew literature, and she herself has done extensive studies in Jewish texts and research into medieval European manuscripts. Deborah's work, as you will soon see, is filled with the richness of the expression of the biblical text. This event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period, but please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you're consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now, Deborah.
Before anything else, I have to thank Peggy Peggy for granting me, for the third time no less, the extraordinary privilege of presenting my work to you in this spot, and her staff as well for putting all this work together, and for Lily for co-sponsoring it. This is really quite extraordinary. Now, this sounds a little bit silly, but my family derives from the Levite line that served in the outer precincts of the temples in Jerusalem long ago. But I can tell you that each time I come into the Library of Congress, it's more than a little like entering the secular Holy of Holies. I also have to thank Steve and Sharon Lieberman for their generous interest and the support that financed the publication of the book. Okay, let me tell you about the actual illuminated manuscript at the core of the book. The project consists of 61 paintings and paper cuts, incorporating the original Hebrew and the 1985 Jewish Publication Society translation of each story. This is a classic European-style illuminated manuscript, size 15 by 12, done on kosher calf skin that I get from a scribe in Israel, in ink, gouache, which is the fancy French word for opaque watercolor, and 23-karat gold leaf and powder. There's also a scrap of palladium for a little, standing in for a bit of silver. Silver tarnishes in manuscripts even, not just our candlesticks. The book is just appearing now, and the paintings are accompanied by my own introductory and commentary material that explain the themes and iconography, along with wonderfully penetrating literary analyses that have been prepared by my father-in-law, the renowned scholar of Hebrew literature, Arnold Band of UCLA. Before I launch into the paintings and themes dealt with here, I ought to tell you something about the genesis of this project. These are personal matters, but just as personal matters take on national significance in each of these stories, personal events in my life shaped my approach to interpreting the tales. The project is a memorial to my husband, David, who passed away after a long, genuinely valiant battle with spinal cord cancer in March of 2009. Now, the Deborah story from the 4th and 5th chapters of Judges had been David's bar mitzvah haftorah, that is, the reading from the prophets that accompanies this cyclical weekly Torah reading. And he really loved it. He relished every opportunity to chant the blood and guts battle epic before our synagogue congregations each year he could. He loved it so much, in fact, that a few nights before he passed away, I had my younger son chant it for him in the middle of the night so that he could enjoy it one more time. So a day or so before he died, my father-in-law and I were talking quietly beside David's bed, and I had set up a home hospice arrangement, and he proposed that I drop the project that I had in progress, Esther, which did not interest him, and take up the Deborah story. Given the timing, the significance was obvious. He gave a different reason, but the clear, if unspoken intent was that this would be our memorial tribute to David. Of course, I agreed, not that I had at the moment the faintest clue of how to deal with this story. But I quickly realized that the divorce story alone was far too slight to make up a book, and I decided to pair it with the book of Ruth, which was probably next up for me in any case. And then one small thing and one big thing felt sort of unbalanced and out of kilter, and I decided to add on another woman's story, and so the Hannah story popped out. This is the first chapter and a half of the book of Samuel, the first Samuel. So before I knew it, I had this luscious project interpreting the only 3 real coherent women's narratives in the Hebrew Bible. Sarah, the other 4 mothers, and Miriam co-star in their men's stories. And after all, Esther is a palace romance where the eponymous woman character really isn't even the prime actor. And of course, I stuck my father-in-law with the job of preparing literary analyses of each of the 3 stories, and he's done an exquisite job of revealing the craft and intent of the biblical authors. Now, there was a clear basic synergy among these stories. All 3 take place within the same handful of decades prior to the establishment of the Israelite monarchy, basically the late 12th, early 11th centuries BCE, the turn of the late Bronze to the early Iron Age. All take place in the same central area of Israel, and each of the 3 captures a formative moment in the consolidation of the nation of Israel. And finally, in each, the driving force is a woman or 2. All that's clear on the surface, but very soon, upon rereading and studying these stories that I'd known all my life, a whole other kind of magic happened, and I discovered a complex synergy of themes that vibrates among them. These women's deeds, their stories, and the values expressed within them reveal the three as the foundational women of the nation of Israel, who embody the very set of qualities upon which the nation of Israel and the Israelite monarchy was supposed to model. It's these themes and values that I'd like to share with you through my interpretive paintings, my visual midrash. So, what are the special themes embodied in these stories? In the Deborah story, clearly the earliest of the three, indeed one of the earliest passages of the Hebrew Bible altogether, we have the first instance since the entry into the land of almost all the Israelite tribes coming together for a common purpose, repelling a Canaanite aggressor. Deborah models strategic shrewdness and confidence in her moment of prophecy. The overwhelming theme of Megillat Ruth is the book of Ruth is the value of kindness and personal responsibility. Hannah presents a particularly fascinating story. While on the surface it simply looks like a touching tale of a barren woman whose prayers are answered with first one and then later 5 more children. But if you dig a little deeper, look into the traditional interpretations, we see a complex interplay of themes about personal responsibility, personal prayer, and good parenting. The national import of personal emotion figures largely in each of these stories. Several of the themes play a role in 2, if not all 3 tales, and all the stories are predicated upon the intimate relationship between the then agrarian people of Israel, the land of Israel, and the God of Israel. These themes become essential factors leading the fragmented tribes toward nationhood under the Davidic monarchy, and even today, in a context of secular government, they model values essential to non-sectarian personal and civil life. A little bit of surprise. I relate these themes through the imagery I choose for each painting. The method I use for composing the paintings draws not upon the Jewish manuscript tradition, but from 15th century Flemish Christian religious art, in particular from Jan van Eyck, who and you'll see one of my most important, to me, what is the most important of his paintings here. Van Eyck composed scenes that made perfect narrative sense, but when you parse the significance of each of the everyday objects that make up, say, in this case, an evidently simple scene of a prosperous couple holding hands in their combination bed living room with a lamp, some apples on a chest, a mirror, a bed. You know, she's got a nice headcloth on. What you see altogether is a complex religious message that amounts to a religious and ethical marriage contract. Van Eyck used and expanded upon a wide Christian symbolic vocabulary that had already been growing for centuries. To the best of my knowledge, however, a symbolic visual vocabulary has barely developed in the Jewish world. This lack has nothing to do with a canard about Jews not being a visual people. That's nonsense. That idea is based on a complete misinterpretation of the role of the second commandment in Jewish tradition. We, in fact, have a rich and ancient tradition of manuscript painting, precious religious ritual objects, and architectural decoration, including the use of human figures. But the imagery has tended to be more narrative and decorative than abstractly symbolic. I'm sure that there must be studies about this, but it seems to me that this absence may well have to do with the fact that Jewish lay communities have always been, even during medieval years, highly literate for the sake of textual study, prayer, and trade, and not just among the wealthiest elites. Consequently, it may have been that the didactic aspects of religious art that were so important in the Christian world were less important in the Jewish community. The internet, with its inextricable weave of images and words, has brought us into a fascinating period, though. The written culture that we inhabit is bound up in a surround of pictorial images conveying countless kinds of meaning, almost subliminally. And given the speed and impatience with which so many of us communicate nowadays, I believe this new environment calls for a much more fully developed Jewish visual vocabulary to keep Jewish thought, religious thought altogether, relevant and accessible to modern tastes. Now, the Jewish literary tradition has preserved a vast source of iconography, in fact, that I use to convey abstract concept. I don't have to pull images out of my own imagination. In one way or another, they're buried in the bookshelves of every educated Jewish family, although most of this stuff has never been used visually before. Beyond the Bible itself, with all its rich imagery, there's an ocean of rabbinic literature that embodies 2 millennia of storytelling and easily visualized interpretations of abstract religious messages. I'm not talking so much about the legal texts in the Talmud that we're all familiar with, but about the Midrash, the body of legend used for biblical exegesis, which may record table talk among scholars, parables spun to illustrate a particular legal point, or legends developed for popular homiletics or sermons. Let me show you how I express all the themes in this book in these 3 stories through imagery drawn from Midrash. Now, a sense of historical community is a core part of my own Jewishness. Given that these stories record formative moments or later perceptions of those moments of the Israelite nation, it's also important to me to convey the material culture within which these characters lived, to give weight and mass to the sense of Jewish historical community. The archaeology of ancient Israel offers a wealth of imagery that I can use both to illustrate these characters' lives and convey the symbolic themes that run through the work. Okay, you've been very patient. Let's talk about the painting that we have here. Understand that I can only give you a hint of all that's going on in each of these paintings. Let's start with the theme of emotion, for in every one of these stories, personal emotion takes on national significance. For the past few minutes, you've been looking at the beginning of the Deborah story. The tale opens in fear. The Israelite hill tribes are being terrorized by the heavy Iron Age army of the general Sisera, who works for Yavin, the king of the powerful Canaanite city-state Chatzor. These farmers and herders who live on the hilltops must fear the depredations of the Canaanites on their herds and crops, perhaps the interruption of their trade routes. And they go to their woman judge or chieftain. We don't quite know precisely what the word shofet meant. And they go to their woman judge chieftain Deborah, who incidentally is the only fully effective, unstained leader in the whole dysfunctional crew of the judges, and they plead that she do something to rid them of this threat. Here I convey the impending threat that the people feel. We see fire. Let's see. There was a way that I could point to things on this, I thought. Maybe not. Okay, I thought there was. Okay. We see fire spreading across the hillsides under an unsettled sky. Someone looks out of their still secure stone house to see that Sisera, and incidentally his name indicates that he's not Canaanite at all, but perhaps Phoenician or from the Sea Peoples. And so I've painted him as a Mycenaean warrior. So Sisera is hurtling across their freshly planted field, destroying the seedlings with his devastating iron chariot. Let me draw your attention to the pottery jars in the corner of the painting on the English page. These jars become an image that reverberates throughout the book. Now, vessels have a particular place in Jewish religious tradition. We all know the Kabbalistic notion that the universe began when the primordial vessel, a metaphor for God's unity, shattered, spraying sparks across the creation spawn from its explosion. I adapt the image of the vessel here with none of the mystical meaning attached to it in Kabbalah. Instead, I use the clay jars that were the ancient Mediterranean version of today's plastic bags. We've all seen them in the archaeology museums. They held everything imaginable, from flour to mascara to documents like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I use them as something of a barometer of the people's mood. Now, I'm not introducing mysticism here again, but rather adapting the image of the vessel whole or broken or cracked to convey the character's perception of the security of their world. If things are good, the vessels are upright and whole. In tragedy, the vessels shatter. Here, the Israelite looking out of her window is still safe, but she feels threatened, and hence the jars have begun to crack. I'm fascinated by the Deborah story, and has nothing to do with the fact that I bear her name. The premise is preposterous. How on earth could a ragtag force of Bronze Age farmers and herders, armed with sickles, even dream of taking on a heavy Iron Age standing army of chariots and horses? I'm convinced that there's only one short period of the year when this plot makes any sense at all. And part of Deborah's genius is that she figures it out. And that moment is at the very beginning of winter, when Deborah might gamble that the rains would start, flood the otherwise dry riverbank, the streambed rather, and trap Sisera's heavy chariots. And when at the same time, Sisera might yet assume that the ground would yet be dry, and he could quickly demolish those irritating Israelite farmers. Deborah won, and the water miracle, the beginning of the rains that carried the day, is compared in Jewish tradition to the parting of the Red Sea. Here we have the battle scenes. Now, from Homer on, soldiers have described the altered state of battle. In fact, in my introduction to this story to Deborah, I quote a poem by the Iraq War poet Brian Turner about the experience of an IED explosion. And that's what I've tried to capture in these angular, blood-red, off-kilter paintings. At right, we have the battle itself, tangling soldiers and horses and weaponry drawn from ancient Canaanite, Mycenaean, and Assyrian battle friezes. At left, we see the whirl of images in the mind of the woman who decisively ends Sisera's reign of terror. I chose Sisera's unexpected and shocking end at the sharp end of a tent peg hammered into his temple by the Kenite woman Yael. Triumph follows the battle, with Deborah's heroic song recounting how she united the tribes and how God caused all the forces of nature to defeat Sisera's fearsome army. We see Deborah surging above the flooding waters of Nachal Kishon, the stream of Kishon, under the stars. This shirah, or epic song, describes how the stars fought from their courses. And after 30 years of marriage to an astrophysicist, I take stars, I've been well conditioned to take stars very seriously. And as it happens, there is indeed a meteor shower that regularly happens just at the beginning of winter. It's the Leonids, and in fact, it was just a few nights ago, so we may very well be meeting just about on the anniversary of whatever the core of truth in this story is. The eagle at upper right that you see also appears throughout the book. In the Song of the Sea in Exodus, God rescues Israel from the pursuing Egyptians as though on wings of eagles, in the greatest of the biblical water miracles. Midrash on this passage compares God's parental care of Israel to that of an eagle for its young, and so I use eagle imagery throughout this work to convey God's providential care of Israel. The book of Ruth opens with an entirely different personal horror and altered reality. Midrash asserts that any story that begins with the word Vayehi, in English, and it was, involves either ultimate sorrow or ultimate joy. And Ruth has both. Her tale moves from early sorrow to a conclusion in complete joy. I'm showing you now the beginning of Ruth, the deaths of the three husbands, Elimelech and his sons Machlon and Chilion. The lives of the three women are shattered, and I've painted the women's perceptions much as I saw the scenes surrounding me in the moments following my husband's last breath. I walked up the stairs to tell my family and friends gathered in our living room and didn't see my staircase and artwork on the walls in any normal kind of way. I saw instead a broken gray kaleidoscope of shards of images whirling around me. And I've tried to capture that despair, that altered reality, altered vision here. You see broken, dripping vessels symbolizing disaster, screaming men and stricken women, groping hands, and everywhere flies, harbingers of death and decay throughout the Hebrew Bible. That tiny sprout, indicating the fresh growth that will spring from Ruth, is barely visible in all the sharp pain. Hannah's story, the first chapter and a half of 1 Samuel, begins not in horror, but in depression. Deeply loved by her husband, Hannah is childless, mocked by her husband's second wife, Peninnah, who has lots of children, and she's lost in her own misery. The archaeological record shows that in this agrarian society, where adequate labor for working the land and proper inheritance of the land were crucial aspects of family life, childbearing was a central element of a successful woman's life, although she would certainly have had many other responsibilities. I've shown Hannah locked in a bubble of gray-green depression, emotionally blocked from her husband's enduring love and attention. A recurrent theme in the Midrashim on the story has Peninnah comparing herself to a full, fruiting olive tree, Hannah to a dry, fruitless one. And you'll see how I carry that image through in this painting here and others throughout the story. At the right, you see the shards of a shattered glass vessel, alluding to Hannah's pain. And now for something completely different. Here's my painting of Shirat Hannah, Hannah's epic song, presenting an entirely different set of emotions. The poem, which is a classic psalm in structure, actually has precious little to do with childbirth, with Hannah's own story at hand. But it does deal with triumph in battle. And any woman who has given birth, or anyone who has accompanied such a woman, knows that childbirth is battle, and also knows the triumph that we feel at finally being handed our new son or daughter. So I've painted this poem as labor contractions, the twisting, pulsating power that takes us over during childbirth, with which we win our new baby. The contractions are painted with imagery of cervical cells, and we see images of Hannah with her baby, of a baby crowning and emerging from the womb, weaponry being sucked back into oblivion, and plants symbolizing humility, sustenance, and perseverance emerging along with the child. This is about the hard work of childbirth and the triumph that follows. All of these stories have at their heart the theme of the inextricable bond between the people of Israel, the land of Israel, and the God of Israel. Israel raises its crops not only for sustenance, but also for sacrifice to its providential God. Its land, promised to the first forefather, produces those crops when they honor God, withholds them when they stray, and is carefully and systematically handed down from generation to generation. In this way, each family knows that its sons and daughters will enjoy sustenance and blessing. Recent work of the Protestant biblical scholar Ellen Davis at Duke has helped me understand this bond in new ways. And let me show you a few paintings that particularly revolve around this theme of the bond between the people, the land, and God. Let's look for just a moment at the final painting for the 5th chapter of Judges, of the Deborah story. The painting expresses the idea that Deborah and Yael's vanquishing of Sisera, ending the Canaanite depredation, allows Israel 40 years of peace. I show Mount Tabor with flocks grazing at its base. You also see a palm tree here. As you may remember, in Psalm 92, the righteous person is compared to the tall, straight palm tree, and there's a sprig of caper plants springing out of the wall just above. A little passage in the Babylonian Talmud compares different plants and animals to qualities of Israel. The last in the series is the caper plant, the same weedy green stuff that springs out of the western wall. The caper, they say, can grow in the harshest, driest, rockiest places with no soil, no water, and still flourish and produce a fresh bud and blossom each morning. This is like Israel's ability to persevere through adversity with nothing more than God's unseen hand to support it. I mentioned the eagle imagery earlier. A golden eagle, that's the kind native to the Middle East, not our bald eagle, reminding us again of God's parenting of Israel. Here at Wright, Naomi and Ruth are walking from Moab, today's Jordan, northwest toward Bethlehem. We can see the two very small figures lost in the vast landscape. Look a little closer, and you can see them moving from Seir Desert in then famine-stricken Moab toward the lush fields of Judea ready for the spring barley harvest, which included, the rabbis tell us, the grain for the Passover Omer sacrifice. The model for this landscape, sans the barley fields, incidentally, is a David Roberts painting, exactly the scene that I needed. And again, we have the significance of the land. Here at Wright, Naomi and Ruth are walking from, I'm sorry, I just did that bit. At left here, we see Boaz's first glimpse of Ruth as she gleans in the fields. The Mishnah and the Midrash spell out how the barley stalks were already bound into sheaves proper for sacrifice while they were still standing in the fields. The micrographic text that you see at the extreme sides is Psalm 136, which traces the history of creation and the Exodus to praise God's power, ending with a statement that he gives food to all flesh, for his loving kindness is eternal. Here, Ruth finds that sustenance. And today, this psalm is a basic part of the Passover Seder service. Let me wind up this theme of the bond between the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and God by showing you the painting that you'll find on the book's jacket. Here, Hannah raises her infant son, Samuel, up to the rising sun in excited joy and fulfillment. Spread beyond the woman, we see her family's land, the place they live, raise their children, farm, and grow the sacrifices that gave her the opportunity to pray to God for a child. Kindness and responsibility toward the family and toward the community are the obvious focus of Ruth, but they play roles in Deborah and Hannah also. At Wright, we see, I'm in the right place. Okay, at Wright, we see Deborah is listening to her angry and frightened people's upset about the Canaanites, assuming responsibility for solving the problem. She's given a moment of prophecy, but we must assume that she's long been taking the responsibility in settling grievances across the tribal lands. The kindness and responsibility of women and men toward one another underlies the advent of Israel's ideal king, David, in the book of Ruth. And it would certainly seem that the primary reason that the Ruth story was needed in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, was to account for David's genealogy. Here we have the famous scene in which Ruth pleads with Naomi, "Entreat me not to leave thee, nor from following after thee." Ruth shows profound devotion and kindness to her mother-in-law, insisting upon accompanying her into the unknown, rather than return to her secure Moabite family. The bird flying across the scene is a stork. The Hebrew name for the stork, chasidah, has the same word root as the Hebrew word chesed, loving kindness. If I can move back to the theme of emotions for a moment, let's look at the figure of Naomi sitting nearly collapsed on a boulder. She's exhausted, completely drained. The Midrash describes her state at that moment eloquently. She feels the rabbi's sense like the remnant of the gray ashes left from a grain sacrifice. And I remember that feeling. We looked at the painting on the left a few minutes ago, but now I'd like to draw your attention to the painting at the right. Ruth is telling Naomi her plan to find sustenance by gleaning. What did she know about that? She'd been a wealthy girl. Reading between the lines, I think we have to understand that the townspeople of Bethlehem, who are silent in this book, We hear nothing from them. But we understand that the townspeople have received the women kindly, with shock, but also with kindness. And I imagine that Ruth has made friends who teach her about gleaning. We never hear the voices of these townspeople, but we have to surmise that they too stepped up and assumed responsibility for helping these vulnerable women support themselves. Now, of course, I have to show you the threshing floor scene. Boaz has already shown Ruth great kindness by, unbeknownst to her, having his harvesters pull extra grain out of the sheaves for her to find. When she surprises him by turning up at his feet at midnight, he declares that she shows great kindness toward him by choosing him over the younger men on the estate. Incidentally, here we have a realistic scene of what a biblical era threshing floor would have looked like. These were not enclosed in buildings or fences or special barns like the ingenious one that George Washington built at Mount Vernon a few miles away. Instead, they were open-air areas of hard-packed earth around which oxen pulled pegged threshing sleds to separate the grain from the stalks and chaff. Now, this painting, humor me for a moment, this painting only tangentially relates to the notion of kindness and responsibility, but I thought you'd enjoy it. Boaz sends Ruth home in the morning with 6 measures of barley, saying that she must not go home to her mother-in-law empty-handed. That's the key word, empty-handed. In Hebrew, it's rekam. The rabbis, this is in Ruth Rabbah, which is the main collection of Midrash on the book of Ruth. The rabbis compare the use of this word to another use in Exodus, this time when God tells Moses not to allow the Israelites to come to him empty-handed, and then proceeds to begin to give the laws of sacrifices. Now, the story's about to start dealing with legal formulas, and although their wording hasn't been preserved, they certainly must have been in writing. They were formulas. So I thought it would be wonderful to show what those words would have looked like to Boaz and those Bethlehem elders who participated in the legal resolution of Ruth and Naomi's problem. On the right, the words of the 2 phrases from Ruth and Exodus are shown in a 13th century BCE variant of Paleo-Hebrew, taken from the Isbet Sarta Ostrakhan in the Israel Museum. I was totally delighted to run across this very potsherd in the Israel Museum earlier this year, and it's just astonishing to me that we can actually see what the letters these people would have been reading really did look like. And this is within a century of the story. It's a pretty good bet he would have been able to read these. Here we have Boaz acting far beyond the call of duty and responsibility, not only redeeming Naomi's land, but also taking Ruth as his wife from deep chesed and love, deep kindness and love. He's gathered 10 townsmen, in Jewish terms, a minyan or a quorum, and used his influence in the town to challenge the anonymous relative of Naomi's late husband and insist that the acquisition of the land involved acquisition of Ruth as wife. When this John Doe, in Hebrew the term was Ploni Almoni, refuses the deal, Boaz redeems the land himself and exceeds any sense of duty by marrying Ruth. He had to actually want her. Now, many scholars consider that the Ruth story, apart from simply accounting for King David's genealogy, was composed during the period after Ezra and Nehemiah reestablished Judean control of Jerusalem under the Persian king Cyrus, when great conflict followed Ezra's insistence that the Jerusalemites give up their non-Jewish wives. Megillat Ruth supports the notion that non-Jews can indeed convert to the Israelite religion and even become the ancestress of the great king. The Midrash here makes much of Ruth's gradual conversion to Judaism from the Moabite religion, beginning with her "entreat me not to leave you" speech, and then completely by the time she marries Boaz. A new development in Israelite religion is, of course, a major theme of the Hannah story. As we know, Hannah is inconsolable about her inability to bear a child, unable to respond to her husband's affectionate teasing. "Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" he asks her. But she's barely able to eat. The rabbis credit Hannah with inventing silent prayer. Eli, after all, is confused and thinks she's drunk when he finds her in the temple mouthing nearly silent words. While her husband, however, offers livestock and grain, Hannah is offering prayer. I show her hands open to offer her silent prayer for a child to Israel's providential God. Since this child will become the prophet who will establish the Israelite monarchy, I paint her bracelet with a palmette pattern that related to patterns that almost certainly decorated Solomon's temple. Curling among the rising words of her biblical prayer is the text of a midrash about how God grants Hannah her wish, culminating in the words of Psalm 145:19. He fulfills the wishes of those who fear him. He hears their cry and delivers them. Finally, we're going to end today with a theme of good parenting. We know that Ruth and Boaz excel as parents, that Naomi cherishes the child Oved, born to her devoted daughter-in-law, whom the townspeople in fact declare to be her child. And we know that their descendant David will bring Israel glory. There's another interesting bit of parenting in this book. Hannah meets her pledge to bring her firstborn son to the high priest Eli to raise, and the text tells us that each year thereafter, she brought the growing boy a new robe. We have a fascinating juxtaposition here in the story of Eli, whose priestly sons have grown into vicious thieves, real monsters, preying upon the families who come to sacrifice their animals, stealing these families' meat right off the very sacrificial cooking forks. Eli has utterly failed as a parent, and he and his sons will soon die grisly deaths, and the priestly inheritance will leave their line. Hannah, in contrast, watches over her son even after leaving him with Eli, and her annual gifts of clothing emphasize the passing on of her and her husband's values to this remarkable son. We know the symbolic importance of passing clothing from one generation to another from the death of the first high priest, Aaron, and the formal passing on of his priestly raiment to his eldest son. Hannah's son, the son of Elkanah, who Midrash recounts, encouraged ever greater numbers of Israelites to accompany his family on pilgrimage, will grow up to become the prophet Samuel, who will rescue Israel from the chaos of the judges and establish the monarchy. In my commentary, in fact, I compare this juxtaposition of parenting styles and sons to another famous pair of contrasting sons, the wastrel prince Harry Bolingbroke and the valiant Harry Hotspur in Shakespeare's Henry IV. Now, at the 11th hour, Prince Hal redeemed himself and sloughed off Falstaff's gross idiocy and transformed himself into Henry V, the very flower of a chivalrous young king. But Samuel imbibed the right values from birth through his mother's milk and continuing gifts of clothing, resisting the malevolence within which he spent his youth, and assumed the mantle of divine service, of leadership of Israel. So in the end, all these stories boil down to the idea in this final image from my illuminations of Ruth. Tears become joy, and Israel's fragmented tribes can now develop into an integral nation united by the physical and moral bonds among the people, the land, and God. Thank you. And I'll be, please do ask questions or else I'll feel terrible. So, any questions? Rocky.
Some of the images had a large feather over it.
Yep, that's the eagle. It's the eagle feather again. You know, there's so much densely packed into these paintings that it was painful to pick and choose what I was going to bring up. And that was one that got left on the cutting room floor. The eagle, again, it's the golden eagle that's native to Eurasia, and it's used to, as an indication of God's parenting of Israel. Yes?
In your book, do you have commentary?
Absolutely.
Like what you've given us?
Absolutely. Everything I've given you and many times more. Many times more. Yes?
Actually, in this figure, as well as the donut-shaped one that had the architecture at the bottom and the stars on top,
Right?
I noticed that you have scallops on the outside. Is that to pick up the theme of the barrel vaulting in your windows to the outside, or is that
Oh, that's interesting, huh?
decorative, like
It's,
version?
no, the scallops themselves don't mean anything. But what I wanted to convey with this shape is how the story starts in tears. It starts in complete sorrow and ends in complete joy. So I have a teardrop shape transforming to this really beautiful form. So, anything else? Yes?
What is the historical commentary, Penny, for why, after Deborah, there are no Jewish women who are
Well, Deborah is actually the first real woman's story. I mean, we've got Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, Miriam, but they don't have stories of their own. They are major players, but they're sidekicks to their husbands. It's the men's stories, but they're important characters. Deborah is clearly the oldest of these stories. In fact, Bible scholars believe this is one of the very, very oldest chunks of the Hebrew Bible altogether. The song, not the narrative. The song itself is very ancient. And then we do have, we do have the other two stories here, and we have Esther, although I don't really consider that a woman's story. It's a palace intrigue, maybe satire. What interests me, though, is in these three characters is how the stories inherently, and then this is emphasized in the rabbinics in different ways, really embody the whole set of character traits that the Davidic monarchy, the people, were meant to embody, and which then, of course, become the central attributes in Christianity and Islam as well, in all the Mosaic religions. Yes?
What I found fascinating in the Deborah text is, speaking of the earlier matriarchs who were sort of secondary in one sense to their husbands.
Right.
That's the first case where you allude in terms of the names Lapidot versus Barak, and that Barak might actually be Deborah's
right.
husband, and that not so subtle play where the husband really cannot do what he has to do without.
That's exactly right.
Do you deal with that in any way in the art of those, because you talk about it?
I mean, I don't have that's, well, I actually do have it back here somewhere.
That's a total flipping of the roles.
Yeah, I mean, I have her with him. I don't, but, okay, let me explain what's going on here. Deborah is described, she's a really mysterious character. We don't know a whole lot about her. And I go into this much more in the book, it's all there. We don't really know what her marital status is. We are told she's described in the Hebrew as Eshet Lapidot. Now that is a formula that could only have meant the wife of someone named Lapidot. There have been commentaries who want to say, well, it's not really that, it means fiery woman, but no, linguistically it means wife of. We don't know anything about this Lapidot character. But the word Lapidot means flame, or torch, and the word Barak, the name of her general, who says he's not going to go into battle without her, because the people won't follow him, they'll follow her. The name Barak means lightning. So people sort of figure that, from the rabbis of the Midrash on, people have sort of figured that Barak and Lapidot are the same character, and that consequently she really is married to Barak. And, you know, it's nice to think that she's out on her own, but it just doesn't hold up. Just doesn't hold up linguistically. Yes?
So you said that the Deborah story is a very ancient
Mm-hmm.
word. Does that indicate that there was a time before the men took over, that, you know, this mythological time?
I don't think so. I don't think there's any grounds for saying that. It's a nice thing to think about. What I think we can understand from all these stories and from the stories of the four mothers is that we have a popular image that the biblical time was thoroughly patriarchal and women were utterly subservient to men. And I don't think there's grounds. I think these stories point out that that wasn't true either. That yes, it was a patriarchal society. Men were unquestionably the more powerful side of society. But the women were paid attention to. They mattered. Their names and stories are very often included, and they really do embody the central qualities here. They mattered. So I hope that answers.
So the judges,
She's the only woman judge.
what do you think the meaning of judges could be besides judges? I mean, the word just means.
It probably means chieftain, leader, you know, may have meant different things in different instances. You know, Samson's one of them, but, you know, this is not a man who modeled a whole lot of wisdom in his life. So physical strength, but not a whole lot of wisdom. Anyway, I think we're...
Okay, thank you very much. That was wonderful. And now you can go in the back here and take a look at the original vellum sheets on which Deborah created this wonderful book. Deborah, I learned now about insects and birds and jars in these drawings. Do you have your own?
My honeybee?
Your honeybee.
Yes. The word Deborah in Hebrew means honeybee. And in my first book, an Illuminated Manuscript of the Song of Songs, I cast it as lovers, series of daydreams of lovers within a walled garden. And honeybees belong in gardens, so there's a little bee planted in each of the paintings. And there was actually a very funny scene in the conference room back here about that once. And yes, I have put honeybees in each of the paintings. And we're at the end one of Hannah. Here you can see the honeybee up in the corners.
Okay,
So.
great. And the books will be for sale as well. So thank you very much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.